Vai ficar verdinha, só apertar no push. Aqui, aguardo o som abaixar e pode começar a falar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dear colleagues, students, and participants of the 47th Brazilian Econometric Society, it's my pleasure to introduce to you this year keynote speaker Gianluca Violante, professor of economics at Princeton and research affiliate of a lot of host of institutions like the NBR, the CEPR, and ESA. In today's lecture, he's going to talk about between a rock and a hard place, the macroeconomics of inclusive stabilization policy. Until fairly recently, the prevailing view in macroeconomics was that representative agent models provide an adequate description of aggregate fluctuations and business cycles. These models were widely thought to capture household behavior. However, as increasingly rich microdata level became available, it also became clear that household responses to income changes are highly heterogeneous. For example, to the extent to which an increase in income or wealth translates into higher consumption depends on household marginal productivity, propensity to consume, which data shows is heterogeneous across the income distribution. This is particularly relevant given the increasing use of expansionary policies during recent recessions. Understanding how different households adjust their consumption, as well as the associated distributional considerations, has become central to the design of effective stabilization policy. A growing literature in macroeconomics takes these differences seriously by incorporating household heterogeneity in new Keynesian models of business cycle. Doing so involves substantial technical challenges, which researchers have only recently been able to address thanks to major advances in computing process power and numerical methods. Professor Violante is widely recognized for being playing a central role in this literature, with major contributions published in leading journals such as the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, Econometric, and the Quarterly Journal for Economics. We are very fortunate to have Professor Violante deliver today's keynote lecture. I very much look forward to learning more about this exciting research agenda and frontier. And without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Gianluca Violante. Gianluca gonna talk. If you have clarifying questions only, please ask. Otherwise, we're gonna leave all the questions to the end. Thank you.
Can you hear me better now? Yeah, I guess so. Okay. I'm going to present some work which I developed with Felipe Alves, which is one of your own, a country fellowman, which is based on 3 papers that I wrote with Felipe. These are the 3 papers, from micro to macrohysteresis, long-run effects of monetary policy under Okun's hypothesis, and the 3rd one, which is the most recent one, inclusion versus inflation stabilization policy in the wake of the pandemic. Because Felipe is affiliated with the Bank of Canada, the usual disclaimer applies, so I'll leave like 5 seconds for you to read the disclaimer. I also decided to give you my main takeaway right away. So in case you want to leave early and go to watch the Flamengo game, you're welcome to do so, and you can pretend that you have attended the lecture. Here we go. So I'm going to start with the observation that labor market hysteresis and scarring effects are a distinct feature of the macroeconomy. But also an important observation that they're really relevant only for the bottom half of the distribution of income. And then the question is, how does stabilization policy deal with them? How should monetary and fiscal policy deal with them? And the key conclusion is that monetary policy, and I'm going to focus almost entirely on monetary policy in this talk, although in some of these papers, we also talk about fiscal policy, and if you have questions about fiscal policy, please feel free to ask. So monetary policy must run the economy hot for longer, essentially. The benefit of this, kind of mechanically, is that no group of communities is left behind, because such a conduct of monetary policy is essentially able to deal with these current effects at the bottom of the distribution. The cost is that one must accept the risk of higher inflation. So we're going to make the point that the trade-off implicit in modern stabilization policy, it's not so much the aggregate, say, unemployment or aggregate output versus inflation, but it's really like inclusion versus inflation. And there are 2 aggregate constraints that make this trade-off, especially challenging to navigate for policymakers, which are the ZLB, which would be like the rock, and the supply constraints, which would be the hard place. That's why that's where the title comes from, okay? Because essentially there is this idea that modern stabilization policy has to navigate between these 2 constraints that are really challenging to deal with. The ZLB exacerbates labor market hysteresis for low-wage workers, and supply constraints exacerbates the risk of surprise inflation. We're going to look at 2 historical examples, the Great Recession and the pandemic, and we're going to look at 2 counterfactuals, policy counterfactuals, to show that basically in these 2 episodes, the monetary authority, the Fed, used good, ex ante would look like good policy rules, good principles, but were kind of used at the wrong time. And then I'm going to conclude making the point that kind of going forward, risk assessment, more systematic and more concrete risk assessment is really crucial to design the right policy response. And it seems like the newest framework of the monetary authority, of the US monetary authority, the Fed, is also taking that into account and seems that has kind of learned from past experience. That's kind of the main takeaway of the talk today. So let me plunge immediately into this concept of hysteresis. I'm going to give you like a quick refresher on the notion of hysteresis in macroeconomics. So hysteresis is a Greek word, as you probably all know, that it means to lag behind, literally. And it has the meaning of the persistence of an effect after its cause has disappeared from a system. It was introduced in the 1850 in physics and has been adopted in economics to mean a temporary shock that has a long-run impact on the economy. Okay, so a sort of it's like a dynamic system with like a long memory, essentially. And you can think of like scarring effects of this like temporary shock on the economy in terms of negative hysteresis, or uplifting effect, if you like, in terms of like positive shock and positive effect on the economy. Here we're going to focus on the labor market and human capital. You can think of like this type of hysteresis also having like large effect on investment, R&D, research, and so on. But I'm going to abstract from all that, although I find them very interesting, and focus on labor market hysteresis and human capital. And the earliest quote I could find of this type of logic goes back to Tobin in 1980, who wrote, with respect to human capital, demand management has important long-run supply side effects. A decade of slack labor markets depriving generation of young workers of job experience will damage their human capital stock. Okay, so this idea that like demand, even demand itself, demand shocks or like policy that affects aggregate demand can have a long-term effect on the economy. Kind of goes back to at least the early 80s. And economists have tried for the last like 30, 40 years to try to identify the effects of like hysteresis in the data, but it's really hard, it's really challenging, because essentially you have to identify a shock that is temporary and then identify the effects on like many years later. So you need a lot of data for an economic system that is continuously buffered by shocks, okay, positive and negative shocks. So it's extremely challenging from an econometrics perspective. I'm not an expert by any means in econometrics, but I want to talk about at least two papers that I find quite convincing, and I think I made quite some progress in identifying labor market hysteresis. The first paper, they're all recent, published in the last 4 or 5 years. The first paper is a paper by Francesco Furlanetto and others, this is the abstract, where they are able to identify demand shocks that can have a permanent effect on output through precise hysteresis effect. And they find strong evidence that hysteresis transmits through a rise in long-term unemployment and a decline in participation, and disproportionately affect the least productive workers. Okay? So this is kind of precisely the type of narrative that I'm going to build in this talk. This is a plot from their paper. They basically decompose aggregate GDP growth into demand and supply shock and what they call temporary and permanent demand shocks. The permanent demand shocks are the ones that have permanent effects on the economy, which are the yellow bars. So you can see that actually the yellow bars in their decomposition account for quite a large share of total fluctuations, and in particular they're especially strong in the Great Recession, which is something I want to talk about, and I will explain why. But notice there are also positive permanent demand shocks, right? I mean, shocks that actually have positive uplifting permanent effect on the economy. This paper exploits time series variation. Another very nice paper that exploits spatial variation across the US is this paper by Danny Yagan. And here, I don't know if you can read, but it says that I estimate the exposure to a 1 percentage point larger local unemployment shocks during the Great Recession on working age employment rates in that local area like 7-8 years later. And the effect is about an elasticity of like 0.3 or so. Okay? And then he concludes by saying that the findings reveal that the Great Recession imposed employment and income losses even after unemployment rates recover. Right? This is going to be also something quite important that I want to talk about later. So also, if you focus on unemployment rates, you're not going to find any evidence of this hysteresis because they're somewhere else in the labor market. In particular, they're on participation and earnings and labor productivity. We'll see. Here's a plot from Danny's paper where he sort of separates the severely shocked states from the mildly shocked states. And the black line is, this is like a diff in diff approach, essentially. The black line is unemployment. And you see that unemployment, it goes up, but then it basically by 2015 is back to trend. While labor force participation, which is the red line, lingers below trend persistently still, okay? Again, I'll discuss this later. Okay, good. So, all right, so there is this evidence of macro evidence on hysteresis. So the question I want to try to understand, to address now, the issue I want to understand is what are the channels really that lead to this macroeconomic hysteresis in the labor market? Okay, why do we see them? Okay, what is the micro foundation? Which is the one that I want to try to build in the model eventually. Here in the work with Felipe, we essentially try to construct a narrative that is based on three mechanisms. The first one is what we call exposure, unemployment exposure. So one thing that we know that is true in US data, I imagine it's true more generally, I know it's true for some EU and OECD countries as well, the unemployment of low-skilled workers is much more sensitive to the cycle than the one of high-skilled workers. Okay, this is a plot of unemployment rates normalized just before the beginning of a recession for various educational groups. And you see that the unemployment rates of the low-skilled workers increases always two, sometimes three times as much as the unemployment rate of the high-skilled workers, okay? But then it also comes back much faster. Again, so there is this high sensitivity to the cycle of the low-skilled workers. Okay, that's kind of fact number one that you see very clearly in all recessions, especially in the Great Recession, when the shock was very large. The second point is what we call the second mechanism is what we call the attachment channel. And here, the observation is that unemployment is the key driver of cyclical movements in participation, in particular in the decrease in labor force participation in recessions. Okay? So this is a plot, by the way, these two plots are from a paper by Bartoben and Aishul Sahin. You see that unemployment rates and participation here normalized to zero at the beginning of a recession. What is plotted here is participation and minus the unemployment rate, okay, so that they co-move. And you see that the unemployment rate leads participation, leads the falling participation, okay, always. So the mechanism here is that unemployment is a stepping stone towards non-participation, towards exit from the labor force. The reason is that, mechanically, there is a very large flow from unemployment into non-participation. So condition on being unemployed, especially in recession, actually have quite a high probability of exiting the labor force, about like 20-25% per month. So it's a very high probability. And so when there's a cyclical increase in unemployment, this flow, pushes you out of the labor force. The third mechanism, which we call persistence, is related to this very large evidence of earning losses upon displacement, which we know are large and are very persistent. This is a plot from a very well-known paper by Davis and von Wachter, in which you see that initial earning losses of the treated, so the people who are displaced relative to the non-treated, the ones who stay employed, they can be up to 30-40% in the short run, but we're interested in the long run. But look at this plot, which says that even 20 years later, these earnings are about between 10 and 20% lower relative to the control group. Okay, so these effects are very persistent and large. Okay, so combining all these three channels, what is the picture that emerges? That when a recession hits, lower skilled workers are more likely to become unemployed. Okay, maybe they're more marginal in terms of the value of the match. A large fraction of them exits the labor force, and the market value of their skills falls. Okay, these earning losses could be skill depreciation, could be loss of search capital, so rents that come from frictions, or it could be stigma, simply stigma, just playing some role, like statistical discrimination for the long-term unemployed playing some role. I don't want to put any label on that for now, but the fact remains that 2 and 3, they make re-entry into employment less likely, and when it occurs, less remunerative for workers. And so this generates these long-lasting consequences of a temporary shock, of an aggregate temporary shock, in particular in the kind of bottom half of the distribution. Okay, so now what I want to do basically, I want to construct a model where I have these 3 channels explicitly in the model, and I want to show you that this model generates some hysteresis, labor market hysteresis, this kind of persistent effect, and then think about policy in the context of the model. Okay, so is there any question on the empirics? Something you're curious about? Okay, but feel free to interrupt if you have clarification questions. So I'm going to write down like a Hank model, an heterogeneous agent model on the household block, which has a New Keynesian supply block. So I will start from the labor market, and because it's kind of central to the model. So think of the labor market being like an island structure, okay, with different islands, essentially 3 islands: employment, unemployment, and non-participation. And there are 5 states, that workers can be in, which are indexed by S. Workers can be employed, unemployed, and out of the labor force. Among the unemployed, they can be eligible or ineligible for UI. And among the non-participants, there are active non-participants and what we call passive non-participants. Okay, this is to distinguish between. There is a lot of heterogeneity among non-participants in the workforce. There are some who actually remain somewhat attached to the labor force, mildly attached. They have maybe a low search effort, and sometimes, in fact, we do see flows from non-participation straight into employment. But there are also workers that exit participation because of, say, of a health shock, or because they have to take care of, like a relative or child and so on, and they're really completely attached on the labor force. They are semi-permanently separated from the labor force, and this is to capture this idea. Okay. All right. Now, let me tell you where these 3 channels are modeled within this structure. So the exposure channel is modeled as follows. So on the right-hand side, you see this matrix, which is a transition matrix across states, from the 5 states to the other 5 states. And these lambdas are transition probabilities. Okay, for example, lambda UE would be a job finding rate from unemployment. Notice that these lambdas, these transition rates, are indexed by Z. Okay, Z is the skill level. Okay, so this is basically where you have this differential exposure in the model across the skill distribution. Okay, you kind of built it into the job finding and job separation rates. So, for example, high Z would have a high job finding rate and a low separation rate. And these lambdas respond differently to the cycle. I'm going to tell you in a second. The second element that we have is this attachment channel, and we have this 3-state model of the labor markets where participation is really key in our story, and so we have this participation decision. The little black arrow is the participation decision. Workers can choose to stop participating at any stage. At any time they can drop out of employment or unemployment and enter non-participation. And there are some exogenous transitions as well into passive non-participation. Okay, you want to think of that, for example, as a health shock, I don't know, or as a different type of shock that puts you into passive non-participation. So we have this transition, and then we have the persistence channel, which is built into this low motion. I'm going to use this into this low motion for skills. You see, which is basically, it's written in continuous time, only continuous time. This is like an AR1 process, essentially. But it's an AR1 process with a drift delta that depends on your employment state. Okay? So skills drift up during employment to capture, again, on-the-job learning or the fact that the worker climbs the job ladder, and they drift down during unemployment or non-employment. Okay, or non-participation, which captures what I talked about earlier, either some direct like scarring effects, or the fact that some stigma, maybe the fact that it's harder. The longer you're unemployed, the harder it is to find a job. Okay, so this is essentially how the 3 mechanisms are modeled in our labor market structure. Let me now move to the rest of the household block. We have a Blanchard-Yari demographic structure in which individuals die at rate chi, and they're replaced by newborns, which draw their productivity from a distribution, and they're born with 0 wealth. Period utility is very simple. If you're a non-participant, you get low consumption as period utility. If you are unemployed, you have to pay a small search cost, which is this kappa u. And if you are employed, You pay a cost of working, which is kappa E, which is possibly large, and then you have some disutility from hours, and we go with like GHH preferences, but this is not essential at all for the results. The budget constraints are standard. Individuals, they consume, they save. So C is consumption, A is saving, R is the interest rate. Phi is a lump sum transfer, tau is a tax. So if you work, you get some labor income, after tax labor income. If you're unemployed and you have a right to UI, you get some unemployment benefits, B. Otherwise, you get your lump sum transfer. The states of the worker, if you think about, when I think about the dynamic programming problem, it's going to be the employment states, productivity, and wealth. And the workers choose how much to consume and to save, whether to accept jobs or not when they receive it, and whether to participate or not. Okay, these are the key decisions that they make. So that's kind of that's the house of block. Okay, the rest of the model is fairly standard. So on the supply side, we have this kind of typical New Keynesian block. You have monopolistic firms with sticky prices, which leads to a price Phillips curve. You have these usual like labor unions with sticky wage structure that is really a micro foundation for a wage Phillips curve. Workers save in one asset, which we model as a share of a mutual fund, then invest in equity and government bonds. Okay, so these firms make some profits, so they have positive value, equity value, and then we have some government bonds floating around. So they all are purchased by the mutual fund, and households hold shares of the mutual fund. And because these two assets, they have the same like risk and liquidity profile, there is no arbitrage condition that says that the rate of return on the two assets has to be equalized. A fiscal authority, as you have seen, taxes, spends, and is going to issue debt. And the monetary authority, this is really the important part of this slide, the monetary authority follows a standard Taylor rule. You can see response to deviation of inflation and output from targets, which I'm going to call an inflation targeting rule, okay, to distinguish it from later rules. So we're going to have aggregate shocks in this economy. They're going to be MIT shocks. So we're going to solve sort of perfect foresight following MIT shocks. What happens to these frictions when the shocks hit the economy? Here, we have taken a shortcut. In principle, one would like to write the whole like search and matching structure here, but we have taken a big shortcut. We're assuming that these frictions, remember job finding rate, separation rate, and so on, they move with hours worked. Okay, proportional with hours worked. So say a positive demand shock is going to increase labor demand, it's going to increase hours worked, and the job finding rate goes up and the separation rate goes down. Okay, and it goes up and down with the same elasticity, so the same percentage points. Okay, which means that for the low-skilled worker, it's going to be a larger increase than for the low-skilled worker because the baseline is higher for the low-skilled workers than the high-skilled worker. For example, for the separation rate, for the job finding rate, the baseline is lower, and so on. Okay, good. I'm kind of done with the description of the model. Yes? Yeah. Perfect. So if you're laid off, you're entitled to unemployment insurance for a certain period. The period is stochastic. On average is like 6 months, which is the average duration of UI benefits in the US. If you quit, you don't, and if you quit directly into non-participation, you also don't have a right to it. Okay, sure. Okay, good. So this is a model that then we calibrate to the U.S. economy. Essentially, we try to be careful in matching some micro facts and some macro facts. I'm going to skip the calibration, obviously, in the interest of time. So I'm going to show you the effect of a transitory negative demand shock. First of all, okay? This is as you can see from the impulse responses, this is a standard dynamics of a negative demand shock for unemployment and inflation. Unemployment increases, you have deflation, and the central bank that follows this inflation targeting rule responds by lowering rates, and so tries to stabilize the economy, basically, and to reduce the impact of this negative shock. All right. Now, let me move to the distribution. This is like standard. Let me move to the distribution. So I'm going to show you always, when I talk about distribution, the top tercile, T3, and the bottom tercile, T1. This is the response of the top tercile. So very small changes in unemployment, almost no change in participation, and a small change in labor earnings. Okay? That's what you see. And importantly, all these dynamics are quickly reabsorbed. They are quickly reabsorbed, right? After about, I don't know, like 4 or 5 years, everything is reabsorbed at the top of the distribution. Here's the dynamics at the bottom of the distribution, which you can see are very, very different. First of all, everything is bigger, okay? All the impact effects are much bigger. But you see that unemployment basically gets reabsorbed relatively quickly. The lingering effect, the persistent effect, this sort of hysteresis, emerge in participation, and it's kind of this attachment channel that I talked about, and in earnings, and in total earnings at the bottom distribution. You can see after like 10 years, earnings are still 1% below trend, even though the shock has been completely reabsorbed in the economy, in the aggregate, in unemployment, and so on. Okay? This is a, if you want to decompose, imagine WT is this like total labor earnings at the bottom distribution that I showed you. You can write it so that you separate the exposure, attachment, and persistence component. The exposure basically is is like the wage times hours times employment, the employment rate. This is participation, PT, the attachment, and this is the average productivity of this group. Okay? And this is a decomposition into these three components of the aggregate response of earnings, the top tercile and the bottom tercile, after 1 year and after 10 years. And here, what I want you to notice is the following, that most of the response, even at the bottom, in the short run, is driven by unemployment dynamics. Okay? But in the long run, in the aggregate and the top tercile, the response is basically reabsorbed. But at the bottom is essentially driven by participation that still lags behind. That's the reason why earnings are low, and productivity, okay, through these like scattering effects. These are the two sources that drag down earnings for a very, very long time at the bottom of the distribution. All right. Now, I talked about inflation targeting and monetary policy. Now, let me add to these simulations the ZLB, the zero lower bound, which is a really important constraint to monetary policy that has been very salient in the last, like 15 years, I would say at least. So here I'm doing exactly the same experiment as before, but I'm making the assumption that the monetary authority cannot go below 0 in setting the nominal rate. Okay? The dotted line are the dynamics that I showed you earlier. The solid line is the dynamics under the ZLB. So you see that clearly here that this economy is stuck at the ZLB for about like 2 years. Okay? And obviously, the dynamics are much worse. Unemployment increases by more, and inflation, you have larger deflation. And just because the monetary authority is unable to stabilize the economy properly as much as they would like because of this constraint. Let's turn to the distributional consequences now. The distributional consequences are worse everywhere, but you see at the top of the distribution, there's not a big difference, really. The ZLB, yes, exacerbates a little bit the effects on productivity, but nothing on participation. It gets reabsorbed very quickly again, okay? But what makes a big difference is again at the bottom. At the bottom of the distribution, you get this, almost like maybe 50% larger decline in labor earnings, in participation, and productivity, labor productivity, it's really dragged down for a much longer period of time. So the key point here is that under inflation targeting, the ZLB exacerbates labor market hysteresis at the bottom of the skill distribution. So IT is unable to cope with the ZLB. Okay, so here, somebody may say, well, you can always use fiscal policy. That's true, you can always use fiscal policy, okay? But here, we're talking about monetary policy. I'm just focused on monetary policy. And I'm happy to talk about fiscal policy later. So, okay, so if IT is unable to deal with the ZLB and this hysteresis at the bottom of distribution, then what should monetary policy do to cope with these scarring effects? And this is the kind of the insight of the second paper that I wrote with Felipe. And it's an insight that goes back to an old paper by Arthur Okun, 1973, which is called Upward Mobility in a High-Pressure Economy. And the point here that he makes is that, if after a recession, like the Great Recession, say, you sustain a high-pressure economy, okay, then you improve the economic outcomes of low-wage workers by allowing them to regain steady employment, rebuild their skills, and climb back the job ladder. Okay? So the key insight is that you have to basically try to compensate for these persistent effects that occur in a recession by running the economy hot for longer afterwards. Okay? You have to expand the economy more and for a longer period of time afterwards to compensate for those effects. So the implication of monetary policy is that monetary policy has to keep rates lower for longer during a recovery. Okay? So if the ZLB is binding, you have to stay at the ZLB for longer. Okay, now I'm going to anticipate something that is very important for later, is that Okun, who was like a great economist, understood that there is, what we call an inflation-inclusion trade-off in this logic. He writes, the sacrifice of upward mobility must be reckoned as one high cost of accepting slack as an insurance policy against inflation. Okay, the first time I read this sentence, it took me like 5 minutes to understand it because it's kind of written backward. Okay, so let me try to put it backward. So if you are a central bank and you have really zero tolerance for inflation, you must recognize that you're sacrificing a great deal of upward mobility from the bottom of the distribution, essentially, because that's the cost. Okay, if you really want to fight inflation. All right, now this logic, okay, actually trickled down to policymakers and to the Fed, but it took some time. It took some time. So I'm going to tell you now a little bit about this journey, like from inflation targeting to lower for longer at the Fed, kind of, okay? So this is a plot of like 10 years from 2012 to 2022 of inflation, top left, unemployment, top right, and the federal fund rate at the bottom. So the first episode I want to talk about is the Great Recession, okay? So you see the, well, you don't see the Great Recession here, but you see the recovery from the recession, starting from 2012. And you see that the Fed started hiking at the end of 2015, okay? And why? Because they saw the first signs of inflation here, right? I mean, they had like deflation, inflation was at zero, and then inflation starts increasing towards the 2% target, and the Fed says like, hey, we don't like this, and they started hiking, okay? So this is precisely what inflation targeting should do, and this is a principle that is in monetary policies called the preemptive restraint. Okay, so you move before you see inflation spiking. Okay, but look at the labor market. Look at the labor market. I mean, unemployment was still about 5%. It was coming down. Okay, there was like no sign really of a really particularly hot labor market. So the question that we ask is, was the Great Recession an episode in which the Fed basically aimed at too little inclusion, pursued too little inclusion to keep inflation at bay? Okay, and well, well, that seemed to be the consensus after a while, okay? So this is here, I'm reporting the news from Business Insider that talks about an article. In fact, it's like an editorial from the whole editorial board of the New York Times. This was in, in March 8, 2015. The editorial board has called for the Fed to hold off on rate hikes. Okay, so the editorial board of the New York Times like, no, you're hiking too early. You're hiking too early. I mean, there's like this, finally after all these like, remember like when you had the jobless recoveries, from the Great Recession, no jobs, finally the economy was producing jobs and the Fed like stops the recovery right away. And in retrospect, this is a sentence from a nice paper by Eggerson and Kuhn. Leading up to the pandemic, a growing consensus emerged among policymakers that the rate increases started 2015 were a mistake. Okay, so the Fed hiked too early. That seemed to the consensus. So what was the risk that was mismanaged? The scarring effects on the ZLB. The Fed didn't realize that there were these like long-lasting effects and kind of failed to keep the rates lower for longer. But in 2020, there was this big revision of the framework, of the monetary policy framework of the Fed, and the framework went exactly in this direction, okay? Recognizing the error of the past. So they moved from a price stability, so the Fed has this dual mandate, as you probably know, price stability and maximum employment. So they went from a strict 2% inflation target to an average inflation target. So the Fed would push inflation above target following low inflation in the past. And they redefined maximum employment as a broad-based and inclusive goal, okay? Which means that the Fed would engineer a hot labor market following a high unemployment rate in the past. So overall, these two components configure what we call a lower for longer strategy, where you run the economy hot for longer during recoveries, okay? And we kind of model this rule in a certain way. You can see it there. Basically, the pi and u are the cumulative shortfalls of unemployment and inflation. The idea is that the Fed would keep nominal rates low until both the inflation shortfalls and the unemployment shortfall were completely recovered. Okay, and now this change in strategy also reflected into a change in the language of policymakers. So this is like Powell that in 2021 says, we're attentive to disparities in the labor market rather than just the headline number. Rather than just the mean, the aggregate, we're attentive to disparities. A strong labor market delivers broad-reaching benefits, in particular to low and moderate income communities. And then Janet Yellen was a Treasury Secretary at the time, says intentional policies focus on driving an inclusive recovery and so on and so forth, okay? So there's repeatedly this language of inclusive recovery, inclusive broad-based and inclusive recovery. So it seems like the new objective is pursuing an inclusive recovery, right? And what are the benefits, okay? If you think about like an inclusive, if you think about, if you think about this lower for longer, what are the benefits of this like inclusive monetary policy, okay? So let's go back to the example of the economy stuck at the zero lower bound. This is and unable to deal with the scarring effects. This is the blue line. Now imagine the monetary authority follows a lower for longer rule, which is the green line. Keeps rates lower for longer, and by doing that, is able to reduce the increase in unemployment rate, reduce deflation. And if you look at the last two panels, which are the total labor earnings at the top and the bottom, well, again, at the top, there is an effect, but it's very small, because the top is kind of insulated from this, dynamics of the labor market at the extensive margin, participation, unemployment, and so on. But this new rule, this new approach, is really effective in reducing these negative effects on labor earnings at the bottom. And in particular, you see that the persistence of these effects is offset. Because after like 10, 15 quarters, you almost go back to zero at the bottom of the distribution. Okay, so lower for longer serves as an antidote to the negative hysteresis at the ZLB. So seems like great news. Okay, not quite, not entirely at least. Okay, because that's the second point I want to make. This inclusive monetary policy has also some dangers and some perils. And let me explain them by going back to this plot and now focusing on the second episode, which is the pandemic. And you see here that the Fed waited a very long time before hiking rates, okay? It hiked rates only in 2022. But why? Inflation had already surged. Inflation was already kind of 8% when the Fed hiked rates. Why did the Fed waited so long? Precisely because the unemployment shortfall, which is here, and not recover fully. Okay, so the Fed didn't want to make the mistakes of the Great Recession. They didn't want to hike too early. They wanted to wait for unemployment to really go back to the natural rate, let me call it, or whatever the steady state, the target rate, before hiking. But this inclusive recovery and the lower for longer, perhaps that's the point we're trying to make the next 20 minutes or so. In order to avoid shocking the labor market too early, perhaps it generated too much inflation. So you had exactly the opposite problem, in some sense, of that you had in the Great Recession. So what was the problem? What was the mismanaged risk? Well, it was capacity constraints, right? These sort of disruptions to supply chains, which were really major over that period. And many criticized the Fed for waiting too long to hike rates. And here's a quote by Larry Summers, who I understand is not exactly the the most popular economist these days, but still a good economist, who says, under just about any theory we have in economics, inflation at this moment was quite predictably an outcome of the policies that were being pursued. And he was talking about monetary policy, he was also talking about fiscal policy. But all right, so that was the mismanaged risk, capacity constraint. So we want to add, to talk about this risk, we need to add capacity constraint into the model. So how do we do it? We do it in a very simple way, really very, very simple. We assume that intermediate good producers face exogenous time-varying maximum capacity constraint. Okay? So you have this Y bar, which are an exogenous variable that fluctuates. And it turns out, but this is an insight that goes back to a paper by Comyn, Johnson, and Jones, it's not our contribution, that when you write the problem, the multiplier on the capacity constraint, which is this zeta CC, enters exactly as a markup shock in the price-Phillips curve. Okay, exactly as a markup shock. So there is an isomorphism between the two. The difference is that the markup shocks are exogenous, while the Lagrange multiplier on the constraint is endogenous and changes across counterfactuals. Right? I mean, this is like a key difference. So we assume that wages are more rigid than prices, okay, which is standard, which means that surprise inflation leads to persistent real wage erosion. If you have nominal wage rigidity, you have these spikes in prices, you have real wage erosion. And now you have to think from the perspective of inclusive monetary policy, this is a problem, because wage erosion poses a threat to the inclusion objective. Because you might do well in killing hysteresis in the labor market and making sure the workers are productive and they're paid basically proportional to their productivity, but then you get all this wage erosion because nominal wages are rigid. Okay, so it's kind of it defies the purpose in some sense of this inclusive monetary policy. Okay, so here is just very simple to show you how these capacity constraints work in the model. So on the left-hand side, imagine you have this aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. The red line is the aggregate supply. This is like the Phillips curve, basically. So a markup shock shifts the Phillips curve, so you go from A to B, okay? And a shock to the capacity constraint tightens the constraint, okay? So you go from this like vertical line to the left to the vertical line to the right to the left. You still move from A to B, Okay, so the isomorphism is there. But what changes is the counterfactual. So suppose that a policymaker tries to contain demand to fight inflation. Then, the so-called sacrifice ratio is very different, right? So in the markup case, you can reduce inflation very little, but you're going to lose a lot of employment. With the capacity constraint, you're able to, to actually reduce. Aggregate demand management is very effective because you reduce inflation a lot without any impact on employment because you are at the constraint, essentially. Okay, so now let's repeat again the same exercise, the same temporary demand shock, okay, with the lower for longer, but now we add a negative shock to the capacity constraint. So imagine, think about pandemic, the Fed was pursuing lower for longer, but a negative shock to the supply chains occurs, the capacity constraint tightens, and this is the red line. So what happens? Well, you get the inflation spike here, okay? You get the inflation spike, which is what I showed you earlier. Just you hit the constraint, inflation goes up. You get the wage erosion. The real wage falls now because you get the wage erosion. And labor earnings at the top, again, don't change very much, really. But at the bottom, you're basically back to inflation targeting. You see, now the earnings respond as much as they were responding during inflation targeting. So the lower for longer is sort of absolutely ineffective here. Why? Because, you're trying to expand the economy, but you're at the capacity constraint. You're hitting the constraints. All you're doing is generating inflation. All that's happening, okay? All right, another thing that is going to be important later is what happens to profits. Actually, profits increase a lot when the capacity constraint bind because prices are kind of sticky and real wages fall, and so just mechanically profits go up, okay? And this is going to be important to think about welfare later. So it's, there is a lot of talk about greedflation around the pandemic. Our model says that, there's nothing particular about greed. It's just that, the real marginal cost falls, prices don't move very much, and you get profits going up. It's kind of mechanical. All right, good. So I want to, in the last few minutes, I want to talk about this policy counterfactual. Okay, we set up the stage with these two policy counterfactuals. First, the Great Recession. So we're going to model the Great Recession with two shocks, a demand shock and a cost push shocks. And we're going to basically do a filtering exercise where we extract the realization of these two shocks to match unemployment and inflation. There's also a big fiscal response during the Great Recession, which is going to be subsumed in the demand shock. So here, what I show you is the data, which is the blue line. So what the Fed did under inflation targeting vis-a-vis the counterfactual, which is the green line, which is the lower for longer. Okay? What if the Fed had followed lower for longer during the Great Recession? Well, you can see it would have generated a bit more inflation, less unemployment, more earnings, and more participation. Okay? And these gains would have been especially concentrated at the bottom of the distribution. Again, at the top, not much happens. For the top, really, all these policies are not very important, at least in terms of earnings. But at the bottom, labor productivity would have almost recovered by 2019. Participation would have been above trend, and total earnings overall would have been above trend, because by running the economy hot for longer, basically the monetary policy would have allowed workers at the bottom to recover these losses and make up for the earning lost during the Great Recession. Okay, that's kind of what we expected. Now let me move to the pandemic. For the pandemic, we have three shocks now. We have demand, cost push, and we have a labor supply shock, just because I think the shock to labor supply was really important over this period. People for a while didn't really want to go to work for obvious reasons. And we use this 3-time series unemployment, inflation, labor participation to filter these shocks and simulate the pandemic. Now, we have this problem, remember, I just want to talk briefly about this. We have this problem that in the Phillips curve, the markup shock, the markup shock and the capacity constraint are isomorphic, okay? So we need some assumption to separate the two. And the assumption that we make is that we want this capacity constraint multiplier, okay, to mimic these supply chain pressure indexes that were built to capture the extent of capacity constraint. And so the green line here is an index built by the New York Fed, and the blue line is the value of the multiplier. And we do quite well in the sense that the multiplier has these two spikes that correspond pretty much to the spike in the data. So we're kind of happy with that. Okay, so in terms of the counterfactual, in terms of policy response, we assume this switch in the framework in 2020 from IT to lower for longer, right? The one that happened that I described earlier. And there was this big fiscal policy response. Almost 2 trillion were paid to households as a combination of transfers and higher extended UI benefits in 2 rounds. One in 2020 quarter 2, one in 2021 quarter 2. So we model all this. And you can see that we do kind of well in terms of in matching these 2 spikes in total transfers. And we also do well in terms of capturing the takeoff of nominal rates relative to the data. So counterfactual. What if during the pandemic the Fed had followed a strict inflation targeting? So kind of this strategy of preemptive restraint instead of lower for longer. Well, that's what we call traditional monetary. Okay, so it's the light blue line. It would have hiked earlier. Clearly, it would have hiked earlier because it would have seen inflation going up. It would have hiked earlier. In fact, it would have hiked 1 year earlier, at the beginning of 2021 instead of the beginning of 2022. So what would have happened? Well, the big conclusion of our counterfactual is that the capacity constraint would not have been binding. Okay? And so the rise in inflation would have been much lower, and the wage erosion, which is the second panel, would have been much, much lower. You see that instead of like a loss of like almost 6% in real terms, you will get a loss of like 4% overall. But it's a big difference. Clearly, also real rates would have been higher, right? Both because of less inflation and because inflation targeting just increases rates earlier. What is interesting is what's going on with the labor market, because I mean, obviously, inflation targeting it kind of reduces demand, because it increases rates a lot in 2021, and so for a while you have higher unemployment, but then because of this lower real wage erosion, aggregate demand is sustained, and in the end, later on, unemployment goes below the lower for longer, the data would have been even lower because, the lack of real wage erosion because of the lack of inflation sustains demand. And in fact, you see that earnings, both at the top and at the bottom, eventually would have been higher. Okay. Now, this is only in terms of labor market outcomes. Now I want to do like a full welfare analysis. And I'm going to spare you the details, but basically what we do, we adopt a money metric measure of welfare change. We express it in terms of months of consumption. And we decompose this like metric, basically household by household, into 3 channels, what we call a labor market channel, a financial return channel, and a fiscal channel. The labor market channel, this corresponds to basically all the prices that enter the household problem, the household block. The labor market channel captures these carrying effects and the wage erosion. The financial return channel captures the change in the real rate and the equity price, the profits. And the fiscal channel captures the labor tax that adjusts because obviously things are happening in the background. There are some changes in the Gormaggio constraint and the tax has to adjust. But this third channel is tiny, so I'm going to ignore it basically. All right, so let me start from the pandemic, okay? Pandemic, and then I'll go to the Great Recession, and then I'll conclude. Well, you can see that the welfare gains from inflation targeting across the distribution are basically positive everywhere except at the top. Okay, so it would have been better to follow inflation targeting during the pandemic instead of lower for longer. And where does this come from? Well, these are the labor market effects, and which I divided into frictions and the real wage. I mean, clearly, inflation targeting generates more of these scarring effects, essentially. Okay, and so you get these losses, which are the purple line, but then you get the gains from wage erosion, less wage erosion, which is the red part. Okay, which are the ones that dominate in our calculations. Also, notice something else, which when we looked at it, we found it very surprising, but then we realized it kind of makes sense. These scarring effects, so these frictions, they're not really super large at the bottom of the distribution, okay? So I told you, up to now, oh, these effects are super large at the bottom of the distribution. It's true. In terms of like effect on participation and productivity, they are stronger at the bottom of the distribution. But the point is that in terms of welfare, they are not very, very costly because these workers are very marginally attached to labor force. Okay, they're always kind of indifferent between working and not working. And so if you move them in and out of the labor force, they're actually not going to gain very much. The biggest scarring effects are between the 25th percentile and the median. So around more closer to the middle class in some sense. Okay, good. Now let's add so the overall, the net labor market effects looks like this. Now, so basically gains, So basically gains overall because of lower wage erosion. Now let's add the financial returns. And what we see is that, well, there are some gains in terms of financial returns across the distribution because the real rate is higher. Okay, so these workers are, their savings, they have deposits in the bank, and instead of getting, minus 6% in terms of like real interest rate, they're now getting, say, minus 2%. And so, there are some gains. And there are some losses at the bottom because remember, the lower for longer generated the capacity constraint hitting, which increased profits and increased equity prices. Now the capacity constraint is no longer binding, no more profit boosting, no more equity price boosting, and who's losing is the top of the distribution, who are the ones who own equity. Okay? And then, the transfer and taxes is really tiny. So overall, basically, everybody kind of gains except at the very top. Everybody would have gained from inflation targeting. All right, now let me contrast it with the Great Recession. So the exercise is still, going from lower for long, going from lower from longer to inflation targeting, okay? And now in the Great Recession, we have losses, meaning that lower for longer would have been better in the Great Recession, okay? Remember, the Great Recession, the monetary authority followed inflation targeting, but lower for longer would have been better. It would have been better because it would have generated less scarring effects and also better financial outcomes in general. That's it. So let me try to conclude in 2 minutes. So what we showed is that scarring effects of recessions are a feature of the labor market. There is some evidence from time series, spatial evidence. There is some micro foundations which we built through this exposure, attachment, persistence narrative. But these are especially strong at the bottom, in the bottom half of the distribution. Okay? Managing hysteresis requires running the economy hot for longer in order to allow these workers to recoup these losses, which has some benefits. The benefits is like being inclusive. The cost is that you accept the risk of higher inflation. So the trade-off implicit in modern monetary policy is this inclusion versus inflation. Two aggregate constraints make this trade-off harder to navigate. The ZLB, which amplifies the risk of hysteresis for low-wage workers, and the supply constraints that amplifies the risk of surprise inflation, which can erode real income. And when we do the counterfactual, it turns out that the ZLB was the key constraint in the Great Recession. So you had these very large skill scarring effects. And IT would have been dominated by lower for longer. But then we go to the pandemic, and the supply chain disruption were the key constraint, not the ZLB, which led to a large real wage erosion. And there, the lower for longer would have been dominated by IT. Okay? So I highlighted these two effects in red because, in some sense, they're very similar, right? They both lead to a decline in earnings, household earnings, individual earnings. But one effect is coming from like skills, if you like, or other effects in the labor market. The other one is coming from nominal wage rigidity and the surprise inflation that generates wage erosion. But they both are equally costly for low-income people. So overall, IT is built on this idea of preemptive restraints, and lower for longer is built on this idea of inclusive recovery. And these are two good principles, in theory. They were just used at the wrong time. That's kind of our conclusion. And it looks like if you want to think ahead about the next recession, it looks like the Fed is like learning from the past, because the new framework, which was released in 2025, emphasizes risk management. Okay? Because in some sense, these are two risks, right? The ZLB and the supply constraints, they're two risks. You have to be able to identify the risk to understand what is the right policy response. And in the documents behind the strategy reassessment, the document says policy decision will be informed by a broad range of data and the committee's assessment of the balance of risks. So again, they sort of want to keep their options open, and depending on the risk, they might act one way or another. They might maybe run the economy hot for longer if they think the main risk is the ZLB, or they might just respond preemptively to inflation if they think there is again, some kind of supply chain disruption risk nearby. And that's it. Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions if you have questions or comments.
Thank you. Why did you need the Blanchard-Yari OLG structure? I didn't get that.
Oh, it's not really necessary. It's not necessary. The reason why we added it initially, because we wanted to do one simulation in the model, which I didn't talk about, that is related to these papers that find that entering the labor market during a recession has long-lasting effects. If you compare workers entering a recession vis-a-vis workers entering an expansion, which is a similar idea of the scarring effect, kind of, right? So we wanted the model to be able to generate that, and it does. But in order to do that, we needed some sort of the young and the old. And so, yeah. It also allows us to match some facts about life cycle, earning growth. So, but it's not. Yeah. The first version we had was an infinite horizon. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Just two quick questions, one on each period. Sort of like in the jobs recovery post-Great Recession before framework review period, I was thinking that sort of like, even though the inflation targeting was potentially the objective, we were also running sort of like the unconventional monetary policy and making some stimulus through the balance sheet. And so like effectively there was sort of like a little bit more stimulus coming on the background. Yeah. So I was wondering, like in your central bank reaction function or your monetary authority function, whether you had a little bit of that sort of like, because in some sense, you can also say that forward guidance rose rates before, but at the same time you're running the balance sheet hot in some sense. So maybe that was countervailing the effect of the monetary policy. And for the post-pandemic effect and kind of like the lower for longer one, I guess there's some evidence from Dube, Alter, and others about kind of like the wage compression post-recession, which we saw that, especially at the bottom of the wage distribution, there's more churn, and sort of like workers are able to sort of like come in and out and get new contracts, and new contracts were like updated for inflation. Then we had sort of like this nominal and real increase in nominal and real increase in wages, especially at the bottom of the wage distribution, which kind of sort of like might have a little bit going a little bit in the opposite direction of the effect. So one question for each part of the.
Okay.
the
Okay. These
Thank
are great points. So let me about QE. I agree. I agree on both points. But QE, I agree. I mean, it's pretty hard to get real effects on QE in this class of models. I mean, you need some. You need to. If we wanted to have QE into the model and have real effects, you would have to do some kind of generalize the asset market, introduce some market segmentation. So otherwise, there is like this Wallace neutrality result in the background that basically says that QE is very ineffective. But I agree. I mean, there would be, in general, there's not a lot of research on QE in these kind of Hank models, exactly because it's challenging. You need like a two-asset structure. There are some nice papers, like Vincent Sturck has a nice paper, for example, and I might forget other papers. So, absolutely. Yeah, so the... the second point was about the earnings at the bottom. So it's true. So labor market was sort of tight at the bottom of the distribution. It's not something that we can directly speak to without having segmented labor markets, in some sense, and different labor inputs. But that, again, there would be the extension to the model in order to try to generate that evidence. Yes. But I think more in general, more in general, if I go back to, let me go back to this plot here. This one. I mean, if I were to plot, I didn't plot it, but if I were to plot the unemployment rate in the model across the distribution, you would see that the unemployment rate at the bottom of the distribution falls way below, say, the target or the steady state, precisely because, this lower for longer allowed a very, very long recovery. So, I mean, the effects of lower for longers on the extensive margin of the labor market, on employment, on participation, and so on, are definitely there, and they're in the model as well. The point is that our theory tells us that the wage erosion were stronger. And, if we think about, like, what we read on newspapers about how everybody hated inflation, and how, for example, I'm going to go a little bit beyond my expertise, but how, the outcome of the election was affected and influenced by the attitude of people towards inflation. They really blame the Biden administration. It seems like this wage erosion is a real thing. It's a real concern.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for the talk. And regarding the second period on the pandemic and the loose for longer, I was wondering if, since in your model you only have rates as a monetary policy instrument themselves, not for guidance, as the colleague pointed out, if the lack of forward guidance as an instrument, and there was a lot of talk about inflation expectations rising and getting anchored, perhaps, if that could have contributed to the dynamics we saw and that you presented, and perhaps with forward guidance maybe controlling that and not just being, not everything being because of a cost push shock, but perhaps that being just the initial push that then an anchoring of inflation expectations ended up self-fulfilling themselves. Without forward guidance, or in the case the loose for longer being a way to just make that even worse, or how would that interact with the loose for longer versus inflation targeting? Okay.
So two points. First of all, the lower for longer rule has forward guidance in it. Okay, that's kind of an important point. I mean, precisely, this idea of keeping rates, committing. It's a commitment because essentially because it's generated by the rule, okay, of keeping rates lower until both the shortfalls of inflation and employment and being completely reabsorbed. There is this element of forward guidance because the central bank says, well, I'm not going to respond, I'm not going to increase rates if inflation goes up. I'm going to keep the rates low until inflation goes up enough to compensate for the deflation of the past. Okay, so it's there. It's there. With respect to the an anchor expectation, again, you need being able to model an anchored expectation. I saw like a nice paper yesterday on an anchored expectation from fiscal shocks, but there was an empirical paper. Again, modeling into like a framework like this is complicated. You need some kind of learning model. In terms of macroeconomic effect, an anchoring of expectations is basically equivalent to a shift in the Phillips curve. Okay, it would like shift up the Phillips curve like a markup shock. The difference is that the markup shock increases costs, but the inflation expectations shock it shifts the Phillips curve without increasing costs. So that's different, but otherwise they are somewhat similar.
Any other questions? No?
Okay, thank you very much again. I really enjoy my time here, and thank you for all your feedback and for being here. Oh, yeah.